Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History by podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Sheila McGinn. And today's discussion is based on her book titled The Jesus Movement and the World of the Early Church. The link to purchase the book will be in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Sheila, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So my first question is, what is the earliest evidence of the early church, and what can we know about them? What limited information do we know about the earliest followers of Jesus after his death?
Well, that's a little bit complicated. The earliest material really comes from probably one of the Roman historians writing in that period, Tacitus. There's another historian contemporary with Jesus whose name is Suetonius. They both write about the Jesus movement. Okay. And we do have contemporary material in the earliest of the four Gospels in the New Testament, which is the Gospel according to Mark. Weirdly, there's also a little bit of archaeological evidence that has to do with crucifixion. Okay, now that's not the crucifixion of Jesus per se, but it does highlight how crucifixion was done in the Roman world, and what kind of impact it had, or at least it suggests what kind of impact it had on contemporaries. And so you have a Roman author who's really viewed as a moralist, mostly Quintilian, who talked about the vertical posts that were used for crucifixion, and he suggests that actually, first of all, that they're always put on major roadways, and secondly, that they ought to be done at fairly frequent intervals as an incentive to public morality, by which he means, as an incentive for hoi polloi not to rise up against the Roman government and try to overthrow it. So what you see are these. It's doing ancient history. It doesn't matter who it is about, whether it's about Jesus or whether it's about Augustus Caesar or whether it's about Julius Caesar. We've got individual sources that we have to pull together, and it's kind of like doing a jigsaw puzzle when you don't actually know what the border is and a bunch of the pieces are missing. And so when you're doing work on Jesus, that's one of the things this book tries to do, is to take people through the process that historians use when doing history, that are the same procedures no matter what historical personage. They don't have, there's not a religious history sort of flavor to it. It's just, this is the way historians work. And so the earliest information we have about Jesus has to do with his execution, and that he was killed by the Roman government for trying to overthrow the state. He had to be a peasant or he wouldn't have been executed by crucifixion. People who were aristocrats or who were Roman citizens had the putative right, if you will. You could still be killed by the state, but you had the right to be executed by beheading, which was considerably less painful because it didn't take days or potentially, more than a week to die. It was quick. It was not dishonorable. Your body was not left unburied to be eaten by dogs and birds, etc. So we know that Jesus, we know Jesus' social class. We know how he was viewed by Rome. And those are kind of the initial pieces we have. And then what we find in the New Testament Gospels, which of course are talked about in the book as well, has to do with Jesus' message, so that we can go backwards from the death of Jesus to figure out, like, well, what did he teach? What did he do to get himself killed like that? The other thing that's really, I don't know if you'd call it an historical datum precisely, but the other oddity that has to be taken into account when doing history about Jesus is the fact that after he was executed, the movement didn't die. Other people were executed. Jesus was about the third or fourth of the messiahs in the first century, and then there were 3 more after him, and they all ended up dead. But nobody ended up claiming that that wasn't the end of the story, except for the followers of Jesus. So there was something that happened after Jesus' death, for which they used the word resurrection, a traditional, pretty loaded religious term, to convey basically what they believe happened after Jesus was dead, and that actually God did not let him stay dead, if you will, right? That death was not the end for him, and therefore isn't the end for his followers either. They didn't talk about seeing a ghost. They didn't talk about, sort of this flaky, mummy's curse, or, afterlife, ghostly afterlife. Resurrection is an embodied experience. And in the Hebrew Bible, when it, resurrection belief doesn't appear in the Torah, but it does appear in the prophets. And so when prophets like Ezekiel talk about resurrection, it's very concrete, very physical, and it only happens to the righteous. So to claim resurrection is not just to say Jesus' message does is not just to say that the movement keeps going after Jesus. It's to say that everything Jesus taught was true, that God validated the authenticity of this divine message, and that the final, Supreme Court, God, raised Jesus from the dead as proof that he was telling the truth about God and about how you should behave toward God. Does that help?
Yes, it does. We have a super chat question. And I was about to ask about Paul anyway, so I'm going to bring it up. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Was Paul a competing faction that ironically is misunderstood as being on the same page as what Jesus taught? That's a pretty twist there, since they didn't teach the same thing.
Um, Jesus taught about God and the kingdom of God, or the reign of God. Actually, in the British translations of the New Testament, they use Commonwealth because that's what the UK is, the Commonwealth, right? In America, we don't really have a kingdom, right? We've never had a kingdom, so it's kind of awkward, but we use the expression kingdom of God as part of the translation. Anyway, Jesus talked about the reign of God, that the political structure of the universe was going to be directly under the rule of God. Okay. And that was his message. Paul must know Jesus taught that. But of course, Paul's message is about the resurrection, right? Paul's message is about Jesus. So it's not that they're competing, it's that it's the before the resurrection, after the resurrection reality. I mean, and there's this, if you will, quantum shift in understanding his own disciples, at least according to the earliest of the evangelists, Mark, the closest of Jesus' disciples, they all, except for the women, they all fled at the end. They thought they were all goners if they hung in there. The women had guts, and they stuck it out, and they were there, not close, but they were there at the crucifixion. So they're the only ones who hung in there. But everybody else fled because they thought all bets are off, that Jesus was wrong. God would not let him die if the message was true. So they split, right? Paul knows now in retrospect, because it's after the resurrection, Paul knows Jesus' message was true, but to convey to non-Jews the significance of that message, he has to do a fair amount of translation, if you will, changing from Jewish ways of speaking and talking, Gentile ways of speaking and talking. So they're not competitors at all. What Paul's trying to do is what every theologian has had to do ever since, which is to recontextualize the message of Jesus to convey to a new audience who think in different language and has different cultural and that kind of thing to translate that message to a way into language that makes sense for his new audience. And you can see that happening because if you read the various letters Paul wrote, he talks differently to the people in the churches of Rome than he does to the people in the churches of Galatia, which is contemporary Turkey. He talks differently to the people in Thessalonica, which is Macedonia, than he does to the people in Corinth, which is actually mainland Greece, right? And so each time Paul's taking this message about Jesus and the resurrection, he's recontextualizing it for this new audience. He doesn't repeat in the letters the message that Jesus taught, but of course, one assumes that that's actually what the oral preaching was, right? That what he's dealing with in the letters, because they're written for specific occasions, specific problems, and specific communities, he's dealing with occasional situations. He's not dealing with what mainline, if you will, preaching, right? That's what's done orally in the context of the community. So we only have this little snippet, of the actual full conversation that was taking place. But anyway, it's people tend to think of Paul as competitive because they tend to think of Paul as a Lone Ranger figure who was like the only evangelist, after the death of Jesus, who was the key evangelist for all of Asia and into Greece, and then onward toward Rome. I mean, all that's like ridiculous. And it's partly driven by a portrayal of Peter and then Paul in the book of Acts, where the book of Acts highlights these two key figures primarily because if you're going to tell a good story and people don't know any of the background, it's a lot easier to keep track of two characters or three than it is to keep track of 20. So all sorts of things that attributed to Paul in Acts might have happened to Paul, but they might have been about other people, and just kind of merged into this one narrative character in the book of Acts, sort of like you see in a docudrama. Oh, I know it's a classic at this point, but when Schindler's List first came out, one of the things that Steven Spielberg did was to create this character of Itzhak Stern, and the things attributed to Stern in the docudrama there, really belong to about 12 different people. But in order to make the movie work, you highlight them all in one character. Book of Acts is doing the same kind of thing, only with Peter and Paul.
So what is Paul trying to do then? Does he preserve what Jesus preached, or does he modify some of the teachings at all? What is he doing?
I think he's very much trying to convey the significance of what Jesus preached. But of course, like I said, we're not getting the oral preaching. What we're getting are the occasional letters to remedy misunderstandings of the preaching, right? And so one of the things Paul's trying to do is to convey, okay, how should we respond to this message of Jesus and also to God's apparent message about Jesus in the resurrection event? Um, so if Jesus' teaching was true and that resurrection proves it, the other thing the resurrection proves, remember Paul's a Pharisee, right? And he's very well educated in the scriptures. He also actually knows Greco-Roman rhetoric and a few, he's a very highly educated individual, generally speaking, but in particular, he's very well educated in the Jewish scriptures. And he's trying to figure out, why didn't I recognize Jesus as Messiah when I first heard about him? What were my misunderstandings, and how, if I go back and read the prophets now, how does that change my understanding? Because I know Jesus has to be the Messiah. Okay. And he knows Jesus has to be the Messiah because he himself has had an experience of the risen Lord. We don't know what exactly that was, but some sort of life-changing experience of the risen Lord. And so So he knows the truth of Jesus' message and of the message about the resurrection. Resurrection in the Jewish tradition, and especially, Americans will maybe know the spiritual dem bones going to rise again, right? Comes from Ezekiel 36 and chapter 37, and it's about the resurrection of the just on the final day, okay, or at the final age. The final age, all the way throughout the prophets, has to do with the day when God will actually be in charge of the world because he screwed up. Okay, and so rather than have a human monarch who is fallible, it's better to have the divine monarch in charge because God's not fallible. So in the final day, at the day of judgment, the just will rise and they'll be rewarded, and there's going to be, and there's, the phrase is, every man neath his fig tree will live in peace and unafraid, right? And you get the images of the lion laying down with the lamb, etc. And it's not for dinner. And so Paul is dealing with this wider context of Jewish understanding of the Messianic age. And now he recognizes that the Messianic age has begun in the preaching of Jesus, that when Jesus said the reign of God is at hand, he actually meant that. The difficulty for contemporary observers, whether you're a believer or not, is that Paul and Jesus both thought that that final age was going to come in their lifetime. Jesus is quoted as saying, this generation will not pass away before the kingdom of God comes in power. Paul still believes that, even though he knows that, Jesus, misunderstood that, because Paul's writing in the 50s, basically. So about 15, not quite 20 years after the death of Jesus. And that generation is starting to pass away. But Paul still believes that the reign of God is coming any day now. And that's why he spends, travels 10,000 miles over 15 years of missionary work. A lot of it on foot, because he thinks that the gospel has to be preached to all the nations before God can come, before the final judgment can happen. So, I used to live in Chicago, and I have to say, at this time of year, waiting for the train to come, waiting for the L, was pretty cold. And if somebody told me that it was going to be an hour or 2 hours before the next train came, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't wait for it. Here we are 2,000 years later and still waiting for that train to come. So for contemporary believers or observers, one of the things they have to admit is that, whoops, they were wrong about that timeline, right? That the final age has not come yet. And I'm not going to talk politics tonight, but all you have to do is read the news a little bit and know that things are not in the best shape, right? And so the promise of that final age is still future. It doesn't look terribly imminent. So one of the things that has to be done in terms of not just translating Jesus to Paul's time, but translating Jesus and Paul to our time, is dealing with this inescapable problem that, that final age is still a future thing.
What is Paul attempting to do with the diaspora?
Well, he lives in the diaspora. I don't know if he was trying to do anything with it. But Paul is following a tradition that you see that there are not terribly many about Pharisaic missionaries during the first and second century BCE, and then first and second century of the Common Era. But you do have a few records, of Jewish missionaries going out, and they tended to be associated with the Pharisee tradition because Pharisees tend to be associated with synagogues where you don't have to actually be close enough to worship at the temple and that kind of thing, and where pilgrimage festivals 3 times a year. That's pretty rough. We're hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem, right? And so you already had some modification of what the legislation, worship legislation, was required for converts in the diaspora. So Paul's just following in the footsteps of these earlier missionaries, and he's doing his work. He travels around because he's got the kind of job that allows for migrating from one place to another, and you still can do your. He's called a tent maker. It's really leather working, more broadly construed, but at any rate, you can carry that with you, just like other kinds of artisans can carry their work with them. You don't have to have a library, to do it. He's not a scribe. So I think what he's trying to do, though, is trying to reach to primarily to a Jewish audience. But you get the sense that, and I think on this score, the book of Acts is probably accurate, that his message is not incredibly well received by Jews in the diaspora. But there are a number of Gentiles who have lived Jews for a long time. The city of Antioch in Syria, for example, was founded in the third millennium BCE, and 250,000 Jews lived there by the time of Jesus. So it's a big city, about 1 million people, but about a fourth of them were Jews. So you have a bunch of Gentiles and Jews living in the same city, and they have to know stuff about each other. Paul's dealing with populations like that, except he's focusing on Asia rather than Syria. And he finds that when he teaches in the synagogue, that it's not well received. And so, but there are folks who are characterized as bearers. That means folks who are interested in Judaism, but they haven't decided to take the plunge and actually become a Jew. And there could be all sorts of reasons for that I won't go into. Anyway, it's the God-fearers or the converts who are sort of on their way to Judaism that seem more interested in what Paul's trying to do than, if you will, your average card-carrying, Orthodox Jew. And so Paul has to use, for example, Stoic philosophy to talk about some of his questions, because that's the kind of thing. It's like talking about ego and id. Nobody has read Freud anymore, but everybody knows it comes from Sigmund Freud, right? And so what those words mean. They're just part of the popular parlance. Same thing with Stoic ethics in the first century. He's dealing with questions, and he's using some of these popular, if you will, pagan philosophical concepts to try to convey what's the depth of the message that he has about Jesus as the Messiah and the inaugurator of the final age of the world, of God's attempt to save the world. I shouldn't say attempt. God's supposed to be successful, right? But so God's work at bringing all creation to fruition. Paul recognizes that he lives in a time that doesn't look like the ideal time at all. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why he thinks he's on the cusp of the final age, because you look around and you think, boy, stuff needs to be fixed. And that's what the Messiah is all about, right? Is remedying those problems in terms of injustice in the world, and making sure that people recognize that it's divine power that can save and not human self-aggrandizement. Paul does not let go, however, in spite of the fact that he has to use, to a certain extent, pagan philosophy and some laid across his ideas. He does not let go of the fundamental Jewishness, if you will, of his message and of his persona. I mean, he remains a Jew his whole life. The scene on the classic scene in the book of Acts on the road to Damascus is not a conversion experience. It's his call as a prophet. Only now he's a prophet for Messiah Jesus, not for some other message about what God is doing in the world. One of the places where you see really clearly Paul dealing with pagan preconceptions and misunderstandings of the Jewish language Paul uses is in 1 Corinthians 15, which is among Paul probably wrote 7 letters to Corinth, but at any rate, this is one of the earlier ones. In chapter 15, he's dealing with this problem that they've had a misunderstanding of what resurrection means. And he goes around and round on the question, but the bottom line is no, resurrection is not about afterlife of a soul. Resurrection is about an embodied experience. And yes, it'll be a spiritual body, not the material body like we have. That's where his Stoic ethics comes in, is this concept of that there's material, that there's spiritual matter. Okay, so it'll be a spiritual body rather than the body we've got right now, but it's an embodied reality, right? But the people in Corinth, being Greek, this concept is just bizarre to them. And so no matter how many times he goes around on this issue, it's a hard sell. Okay. And whether he was successful or not is not entirely clear. Like I said, he wrote probably 6 or 7 letters to Corinth. And by the middle of the 2nd century, the Common Era, we don't really hear about a church in Corinth anymore. So it looks like that the message might not have been incredibly successful in Greece, even though it was quite successful in Asia and Macedonia, and then of course into Europe eventually.
Constellation Vegas says, thank you for another super chat. Did Paul think the end of human rule in God's kingdom would come before he died?
Yes, definitely. He says so. That's why I press on to the goal, he says in Philippians. He was wrong. So was Jesus. Oh, well. But, it created, it gave him a lot of energy, right? If the gospel has to be preached to all the nations before that end comes, then I better not stay in one place, right? So, founding churches along the way, typically we think of him having 3 missionary journeys because that's what Acts says. I'm not sure whether, to what extent that's accurate, but, it works as a general idea of the spread of the message. And he definitely did found churches at lots of various places, not Rome, but lots of places in what would have been called the Roman province of Asia.
Did the early Jesus did the early Jesus movement recognize a conflict between Jewish law and Greco-Roman culture?
Depends on which author you're looking at. I mean, some did, some didn't. One of the places where sort of a neuralgic point, if you will, between Jews and Roman culture had to do with emperor worship. Okay. Now, for a long time, Pompey's conquest of Jerusalem in 63 BCE, Roman rule was inaugurated in the land of Israel. So before, technically, you had a Roman Empire, but 20 years later, you did have empire. The Romans were pretty good at accommodating to local culture, not just to Jews. But one of the things that we find good evidence for is that Romans exempted Jews, for example, from military service, because there's no way you can go into battle without offering a sacrifice first to the gods, right? And especially to Mars, who's going to protect you, because Mars is the god of war. And so, and Jews couldn't do that, right? What Jews could do is pray for the emperor. And some Jews did serve in the army, So some Jews had a little bit more flexibility, if you will, uh, with their conscience about, whether they could observe sacrifice, um, and maybe if they're participating as long as they don't like eat any of the sacred meal or anything like that. So we do have some Jews in the army, but generally speaking, Jews were exempt from the military. And so in terms of Jewish-Roman conflict, the Romans had a pretty hands-off kind of attitude. But you did have certain emperors along the way. And of course, even from the beginning, you know, uh, Julius Caesar is viewed as a god. Augustus, Octavian, who became known as Augustus, is viewed as son of God. All the coinage talk about the emperor, son of God, and Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, is language that applies to the Roman Empire's emperor. So you can't engage in the economy without somehow, if you will, if you're a really strict Jew, you can't use Roman coinage, or you're contaminated by this idolatrous claim. Okay. Which is why it's interesting. The canonical gospels has challengers coming up to Jesus and asking to pay the temple tax, which is a Roman tax that was collected and then used to fund the priests and the sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem. And Jesus says, "Show me the money," um, because he doesn't have one, right? But the challengers do. Okay, so that's interesting. Now, some people say, "Well, Jesus didn't have the money because somebody else was holding on to it." Whatever. Okay, you can come up with reasons for it, but the fact is that he didn't touch the money, right? And so it shows a little more reticence on his part about, um, if you will, being contaminated by this idolatrous claim. Then you had wackos like Caligula, who wants to be worshipped as a god. He's still alive, and he wants to set up a statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem, and everybody lucks out because somebody managed to assassinate him before that order had to be carried out. So you do have these occasions. One of the other occasions is during the reign of the emperor Domitian, who gets divine honors while he's living and is pretty happy with that idea, and gives to, for example, some of the cities on the coast of Asia Minor, contemporary Turkey, uh, you know, tax abatements for like 15 years, temple in honor of the Emperor Domitian. Okay, and they weren't joking. I mean, there's in one of the museums in Turkey, there's the head of the statue and the forearm. Right, the forearm's like 6 feet tall, so the statue had to be about 10 meters. Right, it's enormous. Uh, so you got people like the author of the Book of Revelation, whose name is John, but not the same as the guy attributed with the fourth gospel, irate about emperor worship and about people conforming to the pressure to worship the emperor Domitian, and they're all, basically they're all going to hell in a handbasket because of that. Okay, so you have different views within Judaism of the time, and also different views among the Christ of the time, right? The followers of Jesus, about to what extent do you need to kind of keep free of contact with these kinds of claims that the empire makes, that the empire is divinely established and that the ruler is son of God. Okay, but the son of God language about the ruler, no matter how accommodating you are as a follower of Jesus, the son of God language about the ruler, whether it's Octavian or Caligula or Domitian or whomever, has to conflict more with the message about Jesus, because the early believers are saying, no, 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 that's not the one who's son of God. Jesus is the one who's son of God, right? I mean, that son of God language about Jesus is taken directly from the political sphere and used about Jesus himself. So basically, if Jesus is Lord, Caesar isn't. And there's no way to get around that uh, key issue, which is one of the reasons why you find eventually Roman oppression of the Jesus movement, for example, the persecution under Nero, and then later really heats up much later in the 3rd century under Decius and then Diocletian. Um, but you know, the Romans aren't stupid. They can see that Christians are using this language about their leader, and they thought they ended the whole problem by killing Jesus, but it didn't work. Right now, they're still talking that way. And how can Jesus be Lord if Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not, right? And so there's no way around that.
Aries Aurelian, thank you for becoming a member. Appreciate it. Can you tell us a little bit about how Mark's gospel reminds you of romance novels of the time and the book of Acts reminding you of Homer's Odyssey?
Oh, okay, sure. Uh, that's what's in the book, and I'm doing a revision right now that Stock is going to come out with a second edition. So I know that what the book says is the Gospel of Mark as an example of the novels. I think that's true in the sense that Mark presents Jesus as sort of a divine man figure. Because again, Mark's probably writing not for a Jewish audience primarily, but primarily for a Gentile audience who doesn't know what this Messiah language means in Jewish tradition. So he's trying uh, to he's showing Jesus as a miracle worker and a great teacher, and people flock to him. Uh, and also, death can't stop him, right? And those are elements of the divine man kind of language that you see in some of the Greco-Roman romance. Easier to see, however, and this is the word used, easier to see actually is the infancy stories. In the first 2 chapters of Matthew and Luke, each have an infant story of Jesus, right? The birth and to in Luke's case, early childhood of Jesus. And there's a couple of little Jewish romance novellae. One of them's called Joseph and Asenath, where so if you look at the story in a gospel, the sort of pre-story, right? There's Mary, and she is miraculously with child. Okay, Joseph finds out, wants to divorce her quietly because he's a just man. So he doesn't want her stoned to death publicly, but he wants to help her save face. But he's not taking on this kid that doesn't belong to him, and it's ritually wrong, for him to take Mary as his wife. Then he gets this message from the angel in a dream, because the dream itself is not enough, right? You got to have the double layer there of intervention, and it says, no, it's really okay to take Mary as wife. She's carrying the Messiah. This is a miraculous intervention. I'm part of God, and you've been chosen, right? Okay. If you look at not the details of the story, but here you have a couple, looks like everything's hunky-dory. They're betrothed, they're moving on the way to get married, all looks good. Then some crisis develops, and they get split up, and like everything's over, and then divine intervention happens, and they get together again. You see the similar tropes, if you will, if you read the little story of Joseph and Asenath. Okay. And it's just kind of serendipitous that man's name in that story is Joseph. But anyway, so it's not a matter of details of the story, it's the general idea, right? And part of the reason why I mentioned that in the book is to try to convey to people that what we've got in the Gospels and the book of Acts is not like the modern understanding of history, which is that it's kind of dry, factual reportage, etc., without interpretation, etc. That was actually never true, but that's another question. What we've got in the Gospels and in the Book of Acts is docudrama, except that because there were no movies yet. Okay, and it's the same if you look at Caesar's Gallic Wars, you've got docudrama there too, right? Except that they're by the person who's the key character in the Gallic Wars, as opposed to written by somebody else who was an outsider looking in. That what we've got are you can find historical threads in those books, but every detail in those books is not factual, right? That sometimes you've got characters conflated, sometimes you've got gaps, where like something must have happened in there, but the book doesn't talk about it at all. You've got expansions for effect. And whenever you've got a speech, especially the book of Acts, it's clear that whenever you've got a speech, this is what somebody should have said if they were in that situation. It's not what they actually said. Like Barbara Walters is not there recording it. Okay. And so it is exactly like what you see in the Gallic Wars, and it's very like what you see in the Odyssey. How many times is Odysseus shipwrecked? Paul doesn't have to go between the Scylla and Charybdis, but you got the same kind of shipwreck things going on. You got the same kind of twists of fate happening. You've got the same kind of unanticipated problems. You've even got, to some extent, a little internecine struggle, like you did with, so he gets it mostly at home rather than on the way back to his homeland. So the idea is to convey that this literature is, we've got historical elements in the literature, but we've also got dramatic expansions, and there are ways to see where, it's not a crapshoot as to, well, is this historical or not? No, you use the same, like I said before, you use the same rules when reading these books as you do when reading any other kind of ancient history, and we know that when you get these speeches before the big battles in Suetonius or whomever, no, this is not a recording of what the general said before they went into the battle. This is what somebody should have said to hype people up so that they'd be victorious in the battle to come. Same thing with Paul in Acts, for example, his speech in Athens, right? Well, it's actually a very clever little speech, but I can't imagine Paul ever saying it. It makes sense for somebody like the author of the book of Acts, who's writing closer to the turn of the century, 95 or thereabouts, maybe even a little later, rather than somebody who's writing in the 50s.
What do you make of Paul's argument with James, the Lord's brother, in Galatians?
Oh, okay. What's going on? If you look at Galatians 2, especially, which is the report of this conference in Jerusalem, and the book of Acts talks about that in chapter 15. So basically, you have to read that section of Galatians with the book of Acts kind of simultaneously. Now, Paul's writing, and it's a firsthand account. Okay, well, that's important. Luke's not a firsthand account. I mean, the book of Acts is not a firsthand account. Uh, Acts is also being written at least 40 years later, if not a little bit longer. Okay, so further away. Nevertheless, just like in the Gallic Wars, Paul's trying to make himself look good, just like Caesar was, right? And Luke is trying to make everybody look good. Okay, so there's a little spin, in other words, in both accounts. Uh, Paul may be right that these are evangelists that are coming from James, but he might be wrong. I mean, people somehow think because Paul said it, he has to be right. It's like he might have misunderstood the situation. How do we know? There's no evidence actually that James, the brother of the Lord, who was leader at that point of the Jerusalem church, there's no evidence that they sent missionaries. Okay. I mean, there's evidence that other folks went as missionaries, but not that the Jerusalem church sent them out. Right. So, so I think what's happening there is James, who is the brother of the Lord, one of the brothers of the Lord, and was not a believer during Jesus' lifetime, but became a key leader in the Jerusalem church in the early 30s, early to mid 30s. They have a very conservative, pro-Jewish understanding of Jesus as the Messiah of Israel. Okay, fair enough. So does Paul. The difference is Paul thinks that because the resurrection happened, that the end of the age has already started. And what Isaiah says in chapter 61 about that the light will go forth from Jerusalem and all the nations will stream to it and they'll all recognize the God of Israel. Paul thinks time. And so he's going out to all the nations to bring them all to the God of Israel through Jesus Messiah. The Jerusalem church seems to have thought it's not time for that yet, that it's time for us to talk within Judaism first, that we need to talk to the house of Israel first, and that the Gentile mission will come in the future, but it hasn't happened yet. Okay, so that's one of the issues that's going on there, is that Paul thinks, no, we got to be doing it right now. And the Jerusalem church thinks, no, we shouldn't. And if it's no, we shouldn't yet, then when Gentiles become followers of Jesus Messiah, the men have to become fully Jewish. Right. And so the men should be circumcised and take upon themselves the yoke of the Torah. And Paul says, no, it's the end of the age. They're coming in as Gentiles, so they shouldn't be circumcised. So that's the big question, right? Like I said, Paul might be wrong about whether it's James who's behind the whole thing, but clearly there were evangelists who preached a different strand, if you will, of this message about Jesus. And one of those strands requires Gentiles to fully convert to Judaism first. For women, that means undergoing the mikvah. And for men, that would mean taking on circumcision. This has social ramifications. It could have political, it could even have tax ramifications, for believers. If you're talking about in the land of Israel, if Judea, Samaria, Galilee, that region, it's not a big deal. If you're talking about people in the diaspora, now that's a bigger deal. Because how do you keep kosher? Do you even have access to kosher food? There's a Jewish quarter in big cities like Corinth and Ephesus and in Antioch, and presumably you could get kosher food there. But if you're a Gentile convert, what, you sell your house and you move to the Jewish quarter because there's no refrigeration, right? So you got every single day going to buy food, in the Jewish quarter. I mean, it could take your whole. It's just not reasonable, right? So Paul is accommodating practical situations that arise in diaspora, and actually following the same lines of accommodation that Pharisaic teachers did 100 years earlier. There's this great story of preaching to a king, about converting to Judaism. And the king is actually really happy to convert to Judaism, except for the circumcision thing, which is going to make which is going to unman him before his people, right? There's such a negative view of what circumcision involves that he's going to be viewed as being made a eunuch, even though that's actually not, what circumcision does, right? But rather than dealing with that whole problem of reception, the Pharisaic missionary says, that's okay, you don't have to be circumcised. You're a king. You have to manage, within the parameters in which you can work. So there are certain types of things that can be set aside, right? Paul's of that attitude, whereas the Jerusalem church seems less amenable. But that makes sense because they're in Jerusalem. It's they're at the heart of the Jewish world, and the temple's right there, and so it's not difficult to follow all the shouldn't say that. It's not as difficult to follow all the positive commandments of the Torah. Paul's interested in them following the negative commandments of the Torah, the prohibitions. As long as you observe the prohibitions, that's okay. And what that does in terms of gender is that it makes all Paul's converts equal, whether they're men or women. But according to the Jerusalem church's model, women are not equal. So that's one of the dynamics there. Paul probably lost that battle, if you will. I mean, in the conference in Jerusalem, he makes it sound like they said, "Oh yeah, go for it. Do whatever you're preaching. You're totally on." Okay, and Luke says, "Well, they came to a compromise," and they're probably both wrong. The sense is that Paul did not get a good reception in Jerusalem. I mean, if you follow the rest of Acts, when Paul goes back to Jerusalem, they sort of launder the money that he took from the Gentile churches by having it being given as in payment of a Nazirite vow, which is like uber legal, right? And Paul just wanted them to accept the funds as recognition that the Gentile communities are on a par with the Jewish members of the Jesus movement by saying, "Oh, we want your money, but we're going to do it this way." Says, yeah, they're not. The Gentile communities are not on a par with the Jewish members of the Jesus movement, with the Jerusalem community. Would have made a huge difference if the Jewish war hadn't happened and the Jerusalem community had remained the center point, the center of gravity for all of the Jesus movement. But because of the war and the devastation of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the expulsion of Jews from the city, etc., all the things that happened in the Jewish war between 66 and 73, the center of gravity of the Jesus movement shifted from the Holy Land to Rome because that was center of empire. So Paul, if you will, won, on that argument about how Gentiles should be accepted as members of the Jesus movement, basically by default, because the Jerusalem community, as far as we can tell, the Jerusalem community just disappeared.
Anti-Contrarian 3788, thank you for your super chat. Do you think there is an overlap between former Phoenician colonies and early pre-325 AD Christian communities? People living in Phoenician lands have a more seamless transition into Christianity?
I am not a specialist on Phoenician culture and that kind of thing. Obviously, Phoenicia founded the cities of Tyre and Sidon, and so they probably had influence in that region that we call the land of Israel. Also because they were seafaring, and of course that on the coastline. So, but I'm sorry, I just don't know enough about Phoenician culture to be able to answer that question.
Now
They
I want
weren't
to
an
go
early
back.
target of Christian missionary activity.
So I want to go back to the fire of Rome. Um, did Is there evidence that Christians were behind the fire? And was Paul actually martyred?
Uh,
Was he executed by the order of Nero?
there's e- Even though we have sources, the Roman historians from the period who were contemporaries of Nero, and so are writing very close to the time period, even though we have Roman sources about the fire, all those documents are being written after Nero is dead. Okay. And to a great extent, some of them come from the period under Vespasian, which is 69 to 79 of the Common Era. Some of them come from a little bit later. Uh, Regardless, Nero underwent the damnatio memoriae because the Romans hated him so bad. So, like, actually ran across a place where his name still appears in an inscription in one of the contemporary cities of Turkey. But that's really rare. The Senate and the people of Rome declared that his name appeared, obliterated after he was dead. So all sorts of terrible things are attributed to Nero, who, of course, is blamed for starting the fire in the first place because he was trying to make way for basically what you'd think of as urban renewal, right? He wanted to get rid of a bunch of tenements so that he could build something else there. And he did. He built a new Neronian agora and his etc. And it's ironically the one thing in Rome that's preserved really well because it was all covered up. It was all buried. Nero was assassinated, and so it's preserved really well. Because the way you preserve archaeological sites is by burying them, right? So anyway, only thing we can do is basically speculate. If people think the end of the world is coming any day, not the destruction of the universe, but the end of the political world, right? The end of the Roman regime. And God's going to be directly in charge, and we're going to have divine rule. Okay. God's going to set up a new government, the new kingdom. Okay, and Jesus will be at the right hand of God, and all the folks, the 12, who are going to be judges over the people of Israel, and that kind of thing, right? So you think this is going to happen, and it's going to happen any day now. And God already destroyed the world with a flood and promised never to do that again in Genesis 9. And so there was this theory that, like, people misread Genesis 9, which basically means, yeah, done that, been there. I'm not going to destroy the world again, period. Right. Instead, they thought, oh, God's not going to destroy it with a flood. Next time it'll be a fire. Okay. And so here's this popular idea that God, in order for that transformation to take place, fire's going to happen. Okay. So if you're a follower of Jesus, or even a Jew for that matter, thinking, messianic age could be coming any day now, and this big fire breaks out in Rome, like, do you help it along the way? I mean, there's a really interesting scene in this 1953, I think it was, anyway, mid 20th century movie called The Robe, where uh or no, sorry, Barabbas, where Barabbas comes to Rome, and the fire is happening, and he starts throwing logs and furniture and stuff on to help feed the fire. Then Peter comes along and smacks him upside the head and says, "What are you doing?" And he disabuses him of that bad theology, right? That's not the way God does things. Okay. Um, well, that's a fictional character and it's a totally fictional movie, but it's possible. It's just we don't have any evidence for it. Did Peter and Paul get executed under Nero? Um, the Roman tradition says Peter was executed, was crucified upside down, actually, um, during the massive that took place after the fire, but which may or may not be historically accurate. It's hard to judge. But the tradition says that Paul was beheaded in 62, which was 6 years before the fire. So whether they were both executed under Nero, maybe, but no, not as a result of the fire. Whether any followers of Jesus contributed, I you know I think if you look at the fact that you know there are always people with a second deviation beyond the mean, right? Could be up to 10% of folks who helped contribute to the fire because they misunderstood, or they thought they were wrong. In retrospect, no idea.
So for my
I'm
last
not
couple of
sure about
questions,
the validity of the.
oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, finish
I
what you said.
the sort of has to do with the execution call in Rome. I'm not sure how it ended up in Rome. The only we have ecclesial tradition that says so, but of course, one of the reasons for doing that is because it gets you pilgrims, and that's a moneymaker. We have Luke who says Paul ended up there, but it's a really convoluted, track from his arrest in Jerusalem, in the book of Acts, ended up in Rome, theoretically under house arrest for a couple of years. The fact that he is claimed to have been beheaded also makes me wonder, because Luke claims that Paul was a citizen of Rome, but he's getting physically chastised repeatedly, which is a violation of Roman law, and you can be executed for doing it. Um, and Paul he says he's a citizen of no mean city. He's from Tarsus, which is a capital city. So he never says I'm a citizen of the city of Rome, right? And there's a big difference between being a citizen and a citizen of Rome. So I'm more skeptical of that dynamic of whether Paul's a citizen and therefore whether the execution by beheading makes sense. I'm more skeptical than a lot of scholars. A lot of historians would say, yeah, Paul was a citizen, so this makes sense. I wonder.
So for my last couple of questions, I want to focus on uh, Papias, the Gospel of Thomas, and lastly, Ignatius. So let's start with the Gospel of Thomas. What do you make of the Gospel of Thomas as it relates to the Q source?
Right. There's a little bit of overlap for the sayings in the sayings Gospel of Thomas. There's two. One of the problems here is there's an infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is narrative, and then there's the plain old Gospel of Thomas, which is the sayings, and it's just a list of like 115 sayings. So anyway, we're talking about the sayings list, that Gospel of Thomas. A little bit of overlap. And weirdly, with Paul in a couple places, the reign of God will come like a thief in the night is one of them. So you've got evidence that there's some material in Gospel of Thomas that was already circulating early. Paul's writing in the early to mid 50s. Okay. And so even though the Gospel of Thomas itself was probably not completed till the turn of the century or early, maybe around 125 or something like that, we've got some material in there that comes from our time. Um, There's not a huge amount of overlap between Thomas and Q, however. The connection usually is more, if you will, stylistic. That Thomas proves that there were other kinds of gospels in the early days. That narrative, for the longest time, we thought the only kind of gospel was the narrative gospel, because those are the four canonical ones, and you've got Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip, a few others like that, and they're all narrative gospels. When the Q theory was first created in the mid 19th century, this idea that it could be a list of sayings without narrative interweaving struck people as odd or whatever. But then at the end of the 19th century, when the Gospel of Thomas itself was discovered, I mean, the name had appeared in earlier texts, but the manuscript of the Gospel of Thomas itself was found. Then people are looking at this and they're saying, "Whoa, this is the sayings gospel. This is like what we thought of Q." So basically, the only connection, if you will, is really the type of gospel, the structure of the gospel of Thomas and Q, as opposed to the contents so much.
Who is Papias and Hurriopoulos, and what do you make of the comments that he gives about the Gospel of Mark?
Mark coming from Peter, you mean? That
Yes,
comment?
and does he? And my second part to that question is: does Papias seem to imply Markan priority?
Oh, okay. Okay. I don't think Papias was one of the early church leaders. Hierapolis is one of the cities named in the book of Revelation. It basically, there's this ambit of about 6 little towns around the city of Ephesus, which is the coastal city, and Hierapolis is one of those. So anyway, he's leader of this church in Hierapolis. He is somebody who has a similar world to that what we find in the book of Revelation. So John the seer, not John the evangelist, about the end of the world coming soon. And Papias definitely thinks that the final age is going to be a physical one on this earth, where God, divine kingdom, etc. Okay. But yes, sort of an offhand remark at some point when he's talking about the Gospels, he attributes the Gospel of Mark. He connects the Gospel of Mark with Peter, that it comes from traditions from Peter. Okay. Papias, I think, is confused. I also think he's spinning it a little bit. Okay. The deal is, we don't have the original texts of the Gospels, right? None of those manuscripts exist. First copies we have of any of them, or at least other than fragments, earliest codices of the New Testament Gospels date from the 4th century. Okay. In between the 1st century, when the Gospels were written, and the 4th century, when we actually have the printed, or I shouldn't say printed, but the actual copies of the text, names got attributed to the Gospels, and so we call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But those names didn't originate at the earliest period. Okay. So what Papias is dealing with at the 2nd century is he's trying to establish for his believers that these Gospels have apostolic authority, right? Now, Matthew called a disciple in the Gospel, right? A former tax collector, according to the storyline there. Luke is a disciple because he was one of the companions of Paul. John is viewed as a disciple because he even though he's never identified the disciple in the gospel according to John. That's what people think he is, right? So fourth evangelist as Jesus' beloved disciple, one of the among the closest friends of his. Okay. Um, Mark is never mentioned, right? I mean, there's a little scene in the gospel according to Mark where somebody is at Jesus' arrest and he gets frightened, and all he had on was a loincloth, but one of the soldiers trying to grab at him and he runs away naked because he doesn't want to get caught up and arrested with Jesus. That sometimes is identified with the author, like sort of like the little Hitchcock vignettes that you always see in every Alfred Hitchcock film. Um, but there's no evidence among the 12, for example, right? What Papias is trying to do is say this is really a tradition. This gospel is really authorized, right? It has authority because it goes back to Peter. Okay. It presents Peter in such an obnoxious way. I mean, Peter is slightly smarter than a doorknob in the gospel according to Mark. So it does not look like a story that was written to make him um, the gospel that makes Peter look good is the gospel according to Matthew. Although everybody has to admit that Peter fled at the end and was betrayed Jesus just as bad as Judas did. He just didn't. So anyway, Papias, I think, is wrong on attribution. One of the reasons why the gospel according to Mark is actually in the canonical list, because that was what people thought. If they had thought that it wasn't from an actual apostle, it probably wouldn't be in there. I mean, the Eusebius of Caesarea, who writes the first early church history, or the first church history, I should say, talks about what are the rules judging whether something ought to be in the New Testament canon or not, and apostolicity is one of the traits that a book has to have. So anyway, but Hebrews is in the New Testament because it was attributed to Paul, even though it's actually anonymous, and none of the manuscripts have anybody's name on them. So there were mistakes in deciding what ought to be in the canon versus what not to be in the canon. Gospel according to Mark, I don't think Papias is trying to say Mark's is the earliest one, but I do think he's trying to say it ought to be given a certain amount of theological precedence, which is pretty interesting, because it's the least positive toward the Roman regime. It doesn't pull punches, about the conflict between Jesus and Rome. It doesn't make Jesus' death look nice. It doesn't even make the disciples look smart. I mean, it's a pretty tough gospel in a lot of ways. And that's why you have Matthew and why you have Luke. I mean, why those gospels even exist. Matthew was trying to replace Mark so that you wouldn't read Mark anymore. You'd read this one. And so all sorts of things are modified when you look at what changes are made between what Mark had and what Matthew has, and to some extent what Luke does, although not to as great an extent as Matthew. Papias kind of gets bad press later on. Eusebius thinks he's a dork because he believed in this physical reign of God afterlife, and Eusebius is a more or less a Neoplatonist who thinks that no, we're not talking about a this worldly reality. The closest we're getting to the this worldly reality is the Empire of Rome under Constantine the Great, who is presented by Eusebius as the second Messiah figure.
Hey Frank, good to see you in the chat. He wrote, "I agree that some of the most profound editing in the New Testament is the Matthean editing of Mark."
Hey Frank, how you doing? Yeah, and I have you and I, Jacob, have talked about this before, but I have a book in press right now with Stock that's a brief commentary on Matthew, and one of the key points of that book is here and here and here at all the places where the gospel according to Matthew, where the evangelistic group, I think it was written by a community of scribes, but anyway, where the scribal community editing the gospel are changing the story of Jesus to make it less confrontational toward the Roman regime. But of course, they're writing during the reign of Domitian. So it's a pretty touchy question.
And for my final question, which does have to do with the reign of Emperor Trajan, um, how were early Christians treated in the early second century, and was Ignatius of Antioch actually martyred?
Oh, okay. I think there's good evidence that Ignatius was martyred. I mean, but why is the weird question? I mean, either you have to imagine all these letters were just totally made up out of, ex nihilo, or they make sense because they're being written by somebody who's on the road, you know, on the road to Rome. Um, Ignatius, the best reconstruction I can do, and Sheila has done a really extensive commentary on the letters of Ignatius. And so if people are interested in Ignatius of Antioch, I would say, go look at that Hermeneia commentary on the letters of Ignatius. But just briefly, best reconstruction I can do of Ignatius is that he got ratted out by one of the members of his own community, quite possibly another one of the leaders of the community, another one of there were nowadays you have a bishop in a particular diocese and there's only one bishop, right? But in Ignatius' day, you had more than one overseer in a particular community, and typically overseers uh, were responsible for financial matters. So it could be different reasons why somebody would denounce him. But at any rate, it seems like he got denounced by one of the members of his own community, and now he's on the road to Rome. He got denounced in Antioch when Trajan was actually there, dealing with putting down an uprising in the diaspora. And so, all the local officials would have been really hyper vigilant with the emperor on the scene. Okay. So it makes sense that he would have gotten arrested. Why he didn't just get executed there? I don't know. Maybe he had Roman citizenship, although he never talks about it. Who knows? Not likely, because if he's going to get executed in the Colosseum, bestius by beasts, by fighting with the beasts, probably not. But at any rate, why he's going to Rome in the first place, no idea. But it gives him this reason, various churches along the way, and to make a case for his martyrdom being important. Okay. I don't think Trajan, later church tradition makes people really important in a way that would not have been the case in the political environment of their own day. Um, Christians tend to think of Jesus as the only guy who ever got crucified in the first century. I mean, there were thousands of people who got crucified in the first century, right? Um, I'm sure Ignatius wasn't the only guy who ever got condemned to fight Bestius. One of the key reasons why his letters were retained has to do with this theology of martyrdom, if you will. But the other reason was at least as important is this theology of the papacy, right? Arguing that there ought to be only one bishop in any given community. And I think that's, sour grapes. He got denounced by some folks who were members of his own community. If he'd been the only one in charge, it could never have happened, right? But it's had tremendous impact on the history of the church, of course, because by the end of the 2nd century, all sorts of places were adopting that theory of the monarchical, what's called the monarchical episcopacy. Trajan, we see more about, in terms of his attitude to Christians, we see more about Trajan's attitude in his exchange of letters with Pliny the Younger, who was governor of, so still Asia Minor, but way north. And Pliny is asking Trajan how to deal with folks who are denounced as Christians, and should all of them be executed just because they were denounced, or should there be a trial of some sort? What should be the parameters for judging someone deserving of death versus not? The fact that he's asking the question of the emperor shows you that there's tighter rein on those kinds of procedures than been under Trajan's predecessors. And so it already starts with Emperor Nerva, who was the one just before Trajan. So Nerva was 96 to 98, and then Trajan became emperor in 98 at the death of Nerva. But Nerva's the one who follows Domitian, right? And Nerva is trying to repair all sorts of damage that was done by the emperor Domitian, who also gets his memory damned. And so Pliny's trying to okay, because past procedure under Domitian would have been totally different. It's yeah, just kill them all, right? He thinks Trajan's going to be more careful, right? So he's trying to figure out what should be the parameters. So he gives different possibilities, right? Is being Christian in itself a crime? You have to be associated with some other kind of a crime in order for it to be deserving of death. What should be the rules here? And so what Pliny suggests is, I've had people come in and I've asked them, to confess, and if they confess that they're Christian, I ask them to recant and to burn a pinch of incense to the honor of the emperor, okay, to the guardian spirit of the emperor, okay. And if they'll do that, they'll burn the pinch of incense, which is functionally emperor worship, except that it's presented as worship of the guardian spirit of the emperor rather than the human being. If they'll do that, he has intelligence from folks to say, yeah, real Christ believers won't do that. Okay, burn the pinch of incense, then I let them go and basically tell them, watch yourself. If they won't, then I have them executed. And Trajan basically says, yes, that's the way to do it. Make sure you give everybody a chance to recant. However, don't accept any anonymous denunciations, because under Nero and then later under Domitian, there was a raft of anonymous denunciations. You wanted to be able to actually, face the accuser, and not just sort of take an anonymous, message that came in the mail or whatever. Important because the in the Roman world, if you make an accusation, you're liable for the same penalty that would have happened to the accuser. So if you denounce someone and it's false, you can end up executed, right? So that really puts a brake on how many denunciations you're going to get if you don't accept anonymous denunciations. So Trajan says, yeah, that's the way to go. So he's not exactly loose about it, but he's definitely more conservative, if you will, than his predecessor, Domitian. Trajan and Hadrian's successor are two still very well beloved emperors. If you travel in that region of what used to be the Roman Empire. So if you travel through contemporary Turkey, both of them still get really positive reviews, if you from popular culture. So it's kind of interesting that there's enough of a memory of their balance in how to apply various regulations that Rome had. Did I cover all the bases?
Yes, I believe you did. And just to remind everybody real quick before we close, the link to purchase the Jesus Movement and the World of the Early Church will be in the description below and in the pinned comment, including to the second edition of the book when it comes out. I will add it in the description below in the pinned comment when it releases. And with that being said, Sheila, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here. Have a good evening, everyone.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.